Hi. My my project here is to look at social change and the what I call my paper the creeping modernity, and how modernity is coming into Iranian societies in various ways, although it might not be fully embraced by the government. And to my assessment, one of the very obvious part of this modernity is gender relation. And in order to show that, I have emphasized particular phenomena that is taking root in some metropolitan areas in Iran, like in Tehran, and that's called the white marriage. And the white marriage is basically cohabitation, and it is a very unusual phenomenon in modern society, even without a Islamic government. But the white marriage is so widespread that if you look at some of the social media covering, you find that a big part of discussion is about white marriage and whether or not desirable. And it seems to me that the government is using the social media to encourage people to avoid it and get married. And the interesting thing about it is, in Shia tradition, you have short-term marriage, or called nikah mut'ah. And nikah mut'ah is short-term marriage. You can marry a person of other gender for a very short time. And of course, you have to pay a certain amount of dowry that they promise. And the government is wondering why people don't like that and don't prefer that to white marriage. They don't understand actually the logic of white marriage, which is desire for modernity and perceived modernity. I have largely used Jürgen Habermas's definition of modernity, and he, as you know, relies largely on Hegelian tradition, and he feels that modernity is a sense of self, a sense of subjectivity, a sense of understanding individualism, not only being individualistic, but understanding and being self-aware of individualism. And he argues that a major part of this is freedom, and this freedom also should be based on critical evaluation of the social phenomena and critical reason. And critical reason, he refers, of course, to Immanuel Kant's definition of critique. And anyways, to use this particular concept in my paper, I have focused on how people relate to white marriage. I have to say that data on white marriage is very, very rare because government tries to suppress it, and people are afraid to express it. So I have relied largely on data and research produced inside Iran. And I have found a couple of doctoral dissertations focusing on that, but they were written outside Iran. Now, the question would be why the government is so much against white marriage or cohabitation. It is very interesting. It is to me, largely clear why, because it is a relationship outside the enforcement of Sharia law, which is their ideology. So anything outside that ideology is threatening. And now, of course, they argue largely that white marriage creates bastards, and we're going to be a nation of bastards fairly soon if people keep getting involved in white marriage. So even the man in charge of office of Ayatollah Khamenei, meaning Ayatollah Golpaygani, expressed it in the harshest way, and he said, we don't want to have a nation of bastards, and what is going on, and what is white marriage. So all of these shows how the government is worried about the project of white marriage. And if you look at the dwindling number of marriages and rising level of divorces in Iran, you find another reason for people to get involved in white marriages. And I have to add that the Sharia law and the very cumbersome ceremonies of marriage, that sometimes what people call it a dowry trap, is a major factor, that even families, very traditional families, that I know some of them, are not opposing their offsprings to live with another gender in non-marital status. Why? Why is that? Because this, what they call dowry trap, it means that man should put a certain amount of, or promise a certain amount of property or money to his future wife. And it is such a terrible tradition. It all is from the day one creates conflict between man and wife, and make people very uncomfortable. And also it is turned into a business. A lawyer stated that about very many of these people who are cohabiting now or living in white marriage are people who divorced once and got a house, mainly women, got a house and now living happily with the partner they want. So it is important to look at the very negative role of Sharia law, and how it really separates people emotionally from day one by forcing them into a very strong legal bond. And if you look at the argument is, if we keep people this way, Iranian men are having right of divorce and all that, and this is the only counterbalance to the unbounding power of men. Well, it is somewhat true, but the argument should go deeper, and that's argument for removal of this idea of dowry, because it really keeps people away from each other. It makes marriages dour from day one, and now when people engage in white marriage, that's very interesting. They actually, according to one research that exists today, in a book about white marriage called A House with Open Door, by a guy named Camille. In this book, I think he has studied about 216 couples. I don't know how he got access to them, but he did. And one thing that he points out is they actually live together in some sort of deep understanding of each other emotionally, unlike many traditional families. However, the life of white marriage, he says, is not that long. It's about a couple of years. Now, in order to understand the view of the Iranian who engage in this thing, we don't need to go too far. It is mostly what one researcher called it the idea or the perception of modernity. People engage in this, according to Ms. Golestane, who wrote a doctoral dissertation about this. Ms. Golestane argues that people who engage in this process basically perceive themselves as modern. And that is the main attraction of cohabitation or white marriage. And that's why if you just tell the same couple that why don't you just go to a khund and get yourself a temporary marriage certificate that helps you to have your children legally and to be able to rent houses and to avoid 99 lashes by the government if you get caught, and also being able to tell it to your neighbors and all people, they frown upon it. They think you have insulted them because they find temporary marriage an insult to women and a form of prostitution, and therefore they tend to have this cohabitation, which is, by the way, not very friendly to women. Because another researchers have found that although cohabiting people live in Iran, but they sort of duplicate the relationship they are familiar with, meaning what they experience in their house, and that's the dominance of men over women. And basically, women are not as responsible, men are not as responsible when women getting accidentally pregnant, and they may leave actually after that. So this researcher argues that people may adopt the form, but not the culture, because the culture is something to learn, and these young couples had no way of learning that anyway. Now, to put it together and wrap it up, I want to go back to my argument about the relationship between modernity and freedom and self-awareness, and the idea that modernity is experienced, is perceived, and it is not necessarily anchored in the hard reality outside there, but it is what people perceive as modern. And in Iran, we have one major phenomenon, maybe not very widespread, but it's still quite important in terms of effect of it, and that is the white marriage. And white marriage is the process of people cohabiting, living together, experimenting. Some people say, some of the respondents said, they're experimenting for a real marriage, and sometimes they are successful in that regard. So by my idea of creeping modernity, I mean Iranian families are breaking down, young people in Iran embracing new forms of lifestyle. And if you look at the dwindling level of women's fertility, women's participation in the workforce, women's attitude towards modernity, women's participation in university, then you find out something. And that is women of Iran are actually modernizing much faster than men. And then together, the young generation is distancing itself from the traditional setting by rebelling against it. So the effort of the government to say, oh, let's have a short-term marriage and all that is an indication of lack of understanding of this very particular phenomenon.